Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to talk you through ideas around light and time in photography. So a lot of you aren't new to photography in general, but some of you may be new to black and white photography specifically. And even more than with color, when you're dealing with black and white images, light and time are kind of the fundamental building blocks. So obviously as you work through your first project, I want you to keep these things in mind. But more specifically, your first research assignment in that photographer research category of assignments is actually a short quiz based on the stuff I cover in this video. So make sure to take notes. I've also provided a PDF version of the slideshow to make it easier to take notes. And it's going to be a short quiz, multiple choice or fill in the blank questions only, and you're going to have 10 questions. So nothing too tricky, but you will want to maybe jot down some ideas as I go through. So I wanted to give you a sense of where I stole these ideas of light and time. So this is a quote from John Berger. "What makes photography a strange invention is that its primary raw materials are light and time." And not only is that just, factual in a very basic way, I think it also hints at some of the cool, almost alchemical aspects of specifically analog photography that we're going to deal with this semester. As an entry point into these two ideas of light and time, I wanted to share some work from a series by Hiroshi Sugimoto. This image is showing the Paramount Theater in Newark, and it was taken in 2015. And what we're seeing here is obviously this cool old movie theater, but we're also seeing this white void at the center, and obviously that's where the actual screen is. So what Sugimoto is doing is he is making exposures that last for the entire duration of a movie. So that white void represents, all that we can see of the many, many frames of a particular film. I'll read you this quote from Sugimoto. "A photograph fixes dead reality in the form of an afterimage. But when you are shown a series of those same afterimages, dead reality seems to come back to life. That's what a movie is. To watch a 2-hour movie is simply to look at 172,800 photographic afterimages. Since the birth of civilization, the human race has been fascinated by the idea of resurrection. I wanted to photograph a movie with all its appearance of life and motion in order to stop it again." So obviously these images, again, are really interesting space studies. It's interesting to see kind of the way those spaces are illuminated by just the screen itself. But beyond that, I think the most interesting part of them is the way it does take time and collapse it in on itself. We're seeing, a movie played out, but we don't actually get to see any of the individual frames. Beyond that, I think Sugimoto's terms of dead reality and afterimage are really cool and interesting for you to think about as you begin taking photographs potentially more seriously than you have before. So I'm going to show you some more historical photographs. I'll end by showing you more contemporary images, but I wanted to continue with this way of thinking about photography as a study of time, which we can obviously approach from a lot of different angles. I'm going to share work with you from a photographer named Jacques-Henri Lartigue. This is Cousin Bichonnade. It was taken in 1905. And one of the reasons I like sharing Lartigue is I think the images feel really fun and spontaneous. This one has a literal sense of capturing time as we see this woman kind of fly down the stairs. But beyond that, Lartigue is one of the first photographers we really know of who made important work while he was a child. I think he was maybe 10 or 11 when this particular image was made. And Lartigue was really part of the first generation of children who could feasibly make photographs. Before that, it had required a lot of training and much more chemistry. And Lartigue was photographing with a pretty basic box camera, which obviously as a child he could operate. This image honestly doesn't fit perfectly into either light and time. Obviously, like all photographs, it was created through light and time, but mainly I just wanted to give you a sense of this kind of humor and spontaneity that I think is a cornerstone of Lartigue's work. I believe that Zissou in this weird, inflatable tube, I think they're like rubber pants that allow him to be wearing that suit in the water. I just love this image. And this is the Lartigue image that I think really hits home that idea of time as one of the two essential ingredients of photography. Because we have this feeling of capturing a really particular moment, or Lartigue having captured a really particular moment where obviously everything's in frame. We really get this sense of movement. We really get the sense of seeing this energetic millisecond of this race. And I want you to think about ideas of timing as we move on and look at the next photographer I prepared. And that's Henri Cartier-Bresson. And this is one of his best known images. This is behind the Gare Saint-Lazare, Paris from 1932. So we're moving forward in time by about a generation. And one of the reasons this image became so celebrated is because we're really aware of that tension between the moment we're seeing and the moment right after, where we can feel the heel of that boot almost touch the surface of the water, but not quite hit it. This is a quote from Cartier-Bresson. Of all the means of expression, photography is the only one that fixes the precise moment. We play with things that disappear, and that once disappeared, it is impossible to revive. For us, what disappears forever. Hence our anguish and also the essential originality of our trade. So this is how he developed ideas around the decisive moments. And I think his images probably illustrate this idea of the decisive moment better than I'm about to, but it's really that idea of waiting until all the elements of an image kind of appear before you in the frame. So Cartier-Bresson was known for not really cropping and just, again, trying to wait until that moment of true harmony between each aspect of the image. So shifting forward in time again, I wanted to talk about Garry Winogrand with this idea of time. And here we really feel, I think, time also, but in a very different way, where we sense that the girl on the sidewalk has just made direct eye contact with Winogrand and has sort of got this clear out of here energy. He's also getting side-eyed from the girl who's been backed into the storefront. And Winogrand, I think, probably didn't specifically subscribe to this school of thought, but he just sort of shot ferociously. He unfortunately died at 56 and left behind 2,500 rolls of film that he had never developed and 6,500 rolls of film that had been developed but never made into contact sheets. And doing the math on that, I didn't do this, but at 36 frames per roll, people estimate that Winogrand had 250,000 images that he had made but never looked at, which I think gives you the sense of just how ever-present his camera was. Shooting around the same time was Lee Friedlander, and this is Shadow, New York City. And again, we're kind of getting this feeling of photographer as voyeur, where we really feel Friedlander's proximity to the subject in front, but also this idea of waiting until there's that perfect moment where the fur collar almost creates a texture of hair in the shadow of the figure. So I'm going to shift a little bit and talk more about light. And again, if you've worked in photography, you've been working with light the whole time. Light is central to every aspect of photography, but it's perhaps even more important to black and white photography, where it determines so much, where it determines, the exposure, the contrast, but it communicates how texture is communicated. And without the, extra elements of color, I think it plays an even more vital role here. So I wanted to start with this image by Harry Callahan, Chicago Trees in Snow, partially because we're in the upper Midwest. I've only taught in the Midwest. I lived in Chicago as well for a while, and I've had so many students and even colleagues and peers when I was in school myself sort of complain about how there's nothing to photograph in the winter. And while it might not be fun every time to go out and photograph in the winter, I think this image sort of counteracts that idea, where you can have this perfect marriage between subject and light, and how that really kind of gray, bleak, Midwestern overcast, I'm imagining it's the middle of February light, can produce some beautiful results where we have this stark complete blackness of the trees, the extreme contrast between the white of the snow and the gray of the lake, and the even lighter gray of the sky. And I think this image really communicates how even kind of not fun weather can produce some pretty beautiful photographs. So you can see I stuck to this idea of winter for an extra slide. This is an image by Minor White. This is Frosted Window, Rochester, New York from 1952. And just so you know, I haven't mentioned this up until now, but you might have seen that I've labeled pretty much every image up to this point as a gelatin silver print or as a silver gelatin print. That basically means a darkroom print. You're going to be making silver gelatin prints in this class. So just so you know, that's what that means. I wanted to share this also because it's such a small moment. Minor White's telling us exactly what we're looking at, but because of the way it's lit and because of the textures and the values produced, this really simple, banal scene kind of becomes magical and even a little bit surreal. This is Robert Adams, Colorado Springs, and Adams has talked a lot about photographing in this area. It's where he's from, and how you get this really intense, almost blaring high altitude light. And you can see how effectively he uses that here. If you can imagine Adams photographing this on a really overcast day, all of the values in this image would kind of be pushed together. The whites wouldn't be so bright, even the darks wouldn't appear as relatively dark. So this image, it's almost abstract, and it's really only the light that separates the values and creates sort of the dynamism of this picture. One of the things I'm kind of trying to sneak in here is hints at how to use natural light in black and white images, and maybe how to pair the type of light you have with the subject. And I think this is a really good marriage of light and subject again. This is an image by Sally Mann. This is Nap Time from 1989. And in this image, we're actually seeing, I think, all three of Sally Mann's children sort of at the corners of the image. So it looks like we're getting soft, diffused light from a nearby window. And if you notice, that causes some nice highlights on the face and in the frills of the tutu, but it's also not causing too much contrast. We don't have really harsh, deep shadows on the face of the central girl, and we really get a sense of the textures of the blankets and fabric and skin because the contrast is not incredibly high. So this is a way that you can maybe think about using, again, window light. And we're finally up to the 21st century. I think everything I'm showing you after this point was made within the last decade, or at least it's close. But I'm going to show you a couple of images from Alex Soth's series Songbook. And this is a great compare-contrast to the Sally Mann image. If you're looking at this, you can see the light is so much harsher and brighter, and the differences between the white and black values are so much more striking and intense. And that really creates a different feel, especially in portraiture, where it almost feels like we're looking at this more scientific study. And in the Songbook series, Soth is sort of, I think, trying to dissect American culture a little bit, so that kind of works. So you can see that stark lighting follows him throughout the work. This is Brie Liberty Cheer All Stars, Corsicana, Texas. And Soth, I wanted to highlight partially because he's really influential, but also because he's based out of the Twin Cities. This is Crazy Legs Saloon, Watertown, New York. And again, I think, especially if you're new to thinking about contrast, this is a good study of a high contrast image that I think still works, where we have these really hot whites and these really dark blacks. This is my last image from Alex Soth, and I wanted to really use it to hit home this idea of light. And we're seeing Bill from Sandusky, Ohio, and right behind Bill, we can see his shadow. And since it's pretty much perfectly behind him from our perspective, that lets me know this is almost definitely an on-camera flash or a light pretty much right above the camera in some way. And it does really give this almost kind of flattened, again, I think kind of scientific feel. Feels pretty good. And we can compare that to the other types of light. So I want you to start studying images and thinking of how light is maybe shaping and controlling the subjects a little bit more. So as I near the end of this, I wanted to begin wrapping those ideas of light and time back together again. This is an image from William Harris. This is Last Breakfast. And those of you who have worked with photography a decent amount before probably recognize that we're seeing something called motion blur. So we have an exposure that lasts a fairly long time, long enough for the figure in this to move enough that we can't see their outlines clearly, but we can kind of tell where their head was and where their body and hands were. And not only is this a record of time where we know we're watching, again, elapsed time, but it also shows how photography can start to create new realities and how we know this moment never happened in this exact way, but this document sort of points us to that reality nevertheless, which I think is kind of cool. So I'll close by sharing 4 images from Dylan Hausthor with you from his series Past the Pond Setting Fires. And this whole series was inspired by what I think was like local folklore or the product of the local rumor mill. And it was the story about a woman who set a fire to someone else's house as an act of revenge while she was 7 months pregnant, sat to watch the fire burn, and went into labor at that exact moment. So it's inspired by this event that may or may not have happened. And this is the image Michelle from that series, where we're obviously appearing to see hair on fire. And what I think is interesting about this body of work is it plays with this idea of photographic truth and what may or may not have happened. And we're going to keep returning to this idea throughout the course of, did something happen, or are we just seeing this photographic document that sort of points us to think it happened, but it didn't really? That back and forth of photography, I think, is really interesting. Another thing I like about this work is we go from pretty overexposed images where light is almost overpowering. This image, Anne, I think, shows that. And again, it looks like we're dealing with some sort of on-camera flash where light is almost washing everything out. And then we have this image Web where light is barely illuminating these really fragile spider webs and just allowing us barely enough detail to make out what's going on. And I think that back and forth in exposure, again, maybe points to these different senses of reality or these conflicting senses of reality. And you can see here we're back to that more overexposed aesthetic. And this is Blind Barb, where it looks like we're looking at, I'm guessing, Barb through a field of Queen Anne's lace. And here it looks like we're dealing with classic overcast lighting. We don't see any harsh shadows. It's pretty low contrast, which gives us kind of just more texture and maybe more of a field experience rather than the targeted experience of having bright light in one part of the image. So that's all I've got for you. I hope that at least some of these images were interesting and potentially inspirational as you work on your first project. Don't forget about that quiz on Canvas. And just as a quick reminder, this is your first photographer research assignment and associated quiz, but it's kind of the odd one out. After this point, you'll be doing reading quizzes from the textbook, so make sure you grabbed that. And that's all I got for you. Thanks for making it to the end, everyone.